Problem, however, with pandas is that they don't know how to mate. The only way they learn how is to watch other pandas mate, you see? And so they're keeping them there a little while.
I have concluded that I should not permit the presidency to become involved in the partisan divisions that are developing in this political year, with America's sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day. I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
To continue to fight through the months ahead for my personal vindication would almost totally absorb the time and attention of both the President and the Congress in a period when our entire focus should be on the great issues of peace abroad and prosperity without inflation at home. Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
I will not take your time today with the discussion of the origins of inflation and its bad effect on the United States. But I do know where we want to be in 1976, on the 200th birthday of a United States of America. During the meetings on inflation, I listened carefully to many valuable suggestions. Since the summit, I have evaluated literally hundreds of ideas, day and night. My conclusions are very simply stated. There is only one point on which all advisors have agreed. We must whip inflation right now.
It's clear that the true problems of our nation are much deeper than gasoline lines or energy shortages, deeper even than inflation or recession. It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national law. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America.
It's Arsenal for Democracy. I'm Bill Humphrey. This is episode 423, the third bonus episode in a somewhat monthly series called That 70s Woe, recorded on April 23rd, 2022. Today's episode, The Problem with Pandas, covering U.S.-China relations in the 1970s. If you're not already a Patreon subscriber, we hope you will go to patreon.com/arsenalfordemocracy and sign up for $3 per month to support this series. This series in particular requires a pretty huge amount of time to research and write, and to find the relevant historical audio clips. I really enjoy making them, and I've been releasing the series free to everyone, but it's difficult to set aside the time without financial support from listeners like you. I'm really grateful to those of you who are already donating each month on Patreon. With that out of the way, let's get into it. The first phase we need to talk about can be described as the wilderness phase, 1949 to 1971. To provide some background. October 1st, 1949. After achieving military victories on the mainland earlier in the year, although before completing the mainland operations, and after months of state-building conferences by the communist politicians, Mao declared the People's Republic of China and called for diplomatic relations with the rest of the world. Recognition was largely not forthcoming initially, apart from other communist countries. The veto-wielding Soviet Union began boycotting UN Security Council meetings over the lack of international recognition for the PRC, briefly leaving the door open for the U.S. to get whatever it wanted at the UN, just long enough for a UN-approved intervention in the Korean War in the second half of 1950. Initially, in October 1949, it looked like the U.S. government might actively promote trade with Communist China, sensing an opportunity for lucrative trade without much competition from war-devastated Europe and the Soviet Union. In 1950, China sold $142.63 million worth of goods to the U.S., while the U.S. sold $95.49 million worth in return. But this was not to last. Those figures come from the journal article China and the U.S. Trade Embargo 1950 to 1972 by Jinzhu J. Chen for the American Journal of Chinese Studies in Volume 13, Number 2, October 2006. September 30th, 1950. A year after the PRC was proclaimed, and a few months after the start of the Korean War, PRC Premier and Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai told the U.S. for the final time that the PRC might be forced to intervene against U.S.-led UN forces in Korea if those UN forces crossed the pre-war north-south border at the 38th parallel, which began the following day. On October 19, 1950, PRC forces began entering North Korea. The U.S., before the year's end, had declared a trade embargo against the People's Republic of China that would end up lasting until 1971, despite Western Europe and Japan dropping restrictions by 1959 and 1960, in no small part due to the PRC's ongoing military and economic assistance to North Vietnam during its independence struggle against France, and then after 1954, its efforts to reunify with South Vietnam, all of which was still ongoing by 1971. This brings us to 1971-1972, which would be the era commonly known as Nixon Goes to China, or Panda Diplomacy, if you want to broaden it a little. This is the period that's happening 51 and 50 years ago, respectively. So as I said, the embargo was still ongoing by 1971. Nixon, however, was trying to wind down the Vietnam War in 1971, and China had tested its first nuclear weapon back in 1964. All that realistically meant negotiating with China, even if he was a big anti-communist crusader personally.
As I have pointed out on a number of occasions over the past 3 years, there can be no stable and enduring peace without the participation of the People's Republic of China and its 750 million people.
One of the hallmarks of the 1970s American political rhetoric is conceding over and over that the United States can no longer bend reality to its will. Keep that in mind when we get back to a Carter speech later. For China's part, they had faced very serious risks of military conflicts with the Soviet Union during periods of hostility in the 1950s and 1960s, and they had just as much to gain strategically as the U.S. did from putting themselves on friendlier terms. The first big step taken in public, as opposed to behind the scenes in secret talks, occurred on June 10, 1971. The Washington Post headline the next day read, U.S. ends ban on China trade. Items are listed. They elaborated on the new arrangement while noting ongoing embargo categories related to the war in Vietnam. Quote, under the new order, U.S. exporters will be free to sell to China most farm, fish, and forestry products, fertilizers, coal, selected chemicals and metals, passenger cars, agricultural, industrial, and office equipment, and certain electronic and communications equipment. The president's order does not remove the prohibition against the shipment of locomotives to China, one of the key items that the Peking government is said to want, and of aircraft. Now, as a side note, they did end up getting 10 Boeing planes the next year. Quote, U.S.-China trade was roughly $200 million annually in 1950 when President Truman imposed an embargo after China entered the Korean War on the North Korean side. China's total world trade now totals about $2 billion in exports and the same in imports, with about $1.5 billion from non-communist countries, the bulk of it from Japan. End quote. Just over a month later, on July 15, 1971, Nixon addressed the nation live on television to announce his formal acceptance of an invitation to visit China in 1972 and explained the series of secret diplomatic talks that led to this invitation.
Good evening. I have requested this television time tonight to announce a major development in our efforts to build a lasting peace in the world. That is why I have undertaken initiatives in several areas to open the door for more normal relations between our two countries. In pursuance of that goal, I sent Dr. Kissinger, my assistant for national security affairs, to Peking during his recent world tour for the purpose of having talks with Premier Zhou Enlai. The announcement I shall now read is being issued simultaneously in Peking and in the United States. Premier Zhou Enlai and Dr. Henry Kissinger, President Nixon's assistant for national security affairs, held talks in Peking from July 9 to 11, 1971. Knowing of President Nixon's expressed desire to visit the People's Republic of China, Premier Zhou Enlai, on behalf of the government of the People's Republic of China, has extended an invitation to President Nixon to visit China at an appropriate date before May 1972. President Nixon has accepted the invitation with pleasure. The meeting between the leaders of China and the United States is to seek the normalization of relations between the two countries and also to exchange views on questions of concern to the two sides. In anticipation of the inevitable speculation which will follow this announcement, I want to put our policy in the clearest possible context. Our action in seeking a new relationship with the People's Republic of China will not be at the expense of our old friends. It is not directed against any other nation. We seek friendly relations with all nations. Any nation can be our friend without being any other nation's enemy. I have taken this action because of my profound conviction that all nations will gain from a reduction of tensions and a better relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It is in this spirit that I will undertake what I deeply hope will become a journey for peace. Peace not just for our generation, but for future generations on this earth we share together. Thank you, and good night.
The next milestone was the UN Security Council reshuffle. On October 25, 1971, the UN General Assembly voted not only to shift the Chinese seat on the Security Council from the government in Taiwan to the government on the mainland, which the U.S. was ready to concede defeat on, but also to expel the government in Taiwan from the UN altogether, which the U.S. opposed. The following day, George H.W. Bush, Nixon's ambassador to the United Nations, appeared on ABC's late-night Dick Cavett show to discuss the vote, including the UN Assembly delegates openly cheering the result and jeering Ambassador Bush.
But now another view of that cheering is that it was not against Taiwan, largely, that the Chinese needn't be offended, but that it was against you representing the U.S. for their strong-arm bulldozing tactics, and the fact that those had failed was what they were cheering about, that the big old USA could no longer twist people's arms.
Yeah, I expect there was some of that. But the thing, it wasn't glee and clapping that troubles the ambassadors today at the UN, or the Secretariat, or the members of Secretary General U Thant's staff. Many ambassadors have come up to me who were on the other side and said, well, this was an ugly spectacle. It wasn't glee. I mean, there was plenty of that there, but there was a certain mood of ugliness, and the thing that troubled me about it was, and this I'm not being recriminatory, we're going forward, not backwards, but you've asked a very question that's on people's minds. The thing that troubled me about it was, here were the Republic of China, decent men, having suffered indignity after indignity in the speeches, throwing them on the garbage heap of history, decent men sitting there, and then in their final moment of ignominy, not having the institution, the UN, not any delegation, but the UN as a body, not having the common decency to treat them as human beings. And this is what troubled me. And maybe maybe I shouldn't get so emotionally involved with people, but There's a way to do things with grace and dignity, and the organization simply did not do that. Now, as far as the United States goes, sure, there was some of that. I got up to speak afterward and was hissed from the audience, and we can take that. We can take care of ourselves. I didn't like it. I think it's beneath the dignity of the UN. But again, we can take care of ourselves. But what troubled the ambassadors there and the reporters there and the members of the Secretariat there was the mood not of glee. Heaven's sake, some people have been working for this for a long time, and in victory they should be grateful. But there was a certain ugliness there. There was a certain kind of you carry the iron sheet, and I'll have this forked stick, and we'll kind of jab one another. There was and some of it was just simply the culmination of victory after hard work. But I'm afraid it was a little uglier than that, and I think that's what the presidential spokesman was trying to say, and it's not a partisan thing. It's not aimed at any nation or anything like this, and the UN, in my view, will recover from it.
George H.W. Bush would later go on to serve as President Ford's top diplomat in the People's Republic of China for about a year. Interestingly, according to the secret Nixon tapes from earlier in 1971, Dick Cavett was one of the president's public enemies, so make of that interview what you will.
What the hell is Cavett? Oh, Christ, he's terrible. He's impossible. He loads every program. Automatically, nothing you can do about it. We've complained bitterly about the Cavett ship. Well, is there any way we could screw it? That's what I mean. There must be ways. We've been trying to.
Finally, as promised, Nixon made his one-week trip to Beijing via Shanghai in February 1972, just over 50 years ago. Here's the official joint summary of the tour itinerary and the participants from the joint communiqué issued at the end, and as always, linked in the notes. President Richard Nixon of the United States of America visited the People's Republic of China at the invitation of Premier Zhou Enlai and the People's Republic of China from February 21st to February 28, 1972. Accompanying the president were Mrs. Nixon, U.S. Secretary of State William Rogers, Assistant to the President Dr. Henry Kissinger, and other American officials. President Nixon met with Chairman Mao Zedong of the Communist Party of China on February 21st. The two leaders had a serious and frank exchange of views on Sino-U.S. relations and world affairs. During the visit, extensive, earnest, and frank discussions were held between President Nixon and Premier Zhou Enlai on the normalization of relations between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, as well as on other matters of interest to both sides. In addition, Secretary of State William Rogers and Foreign Minister Chi Peng-fei held talks in the same spirit. President Nixon and his party visited Peking and viewed cultural, industrial, and agricultural sites, and they also toured Hangzhou and Shanghai, where, continuing discussions with Chinese leaders, they viewed similar places of interest." End quote. As noted, Nixon met with Mao for a bit, but most of the trip was about diplomatic events with Premier Zhou Enlai, including various televised speeches back and forth and cross-cultural performances such as a Chinese military band playing America the Beautiful. For American audiences, the most important element, besides a few key photo ops, was probably Nixon's 6.5-minute toast to Zhou Enlai on February 25, 1972, which was carried live on American television. Here are a couple excerpts.
Yet what we say here will not be long remembered. What we do here can change the world. As you said in your toast, the Chinese people are a great people. The American people are a great people. If our two people are enemies, the future of this world we share together is dark indeed. But if we can find common ground to work together, the chance for world peace is immeasurably increased. I think of all the children in the world, in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas, most of whom were born since the date of the foundation of the People's Republic of China. What legacy shall we leave our children? Are they destined to die for the hatreds which have plagued the old world? Or are they destined to live because we had the vision to build a new world? There is no reason for us to be enemies. Neither of us seeks the territory of the other. Neither of us seeks domination over the other. Neither of us seeks to stretch out our hands and rule the world. Chairman Mao has written, "So many deeds cry out to be done, and always urgently. The world rolls on. Time passes. 10,000 years are too long. Seize the day. Seize the hour. This is the hour. This is the day for our two peoples to rise to the heights of greatness which can build a new and a better world."
As noted earlier, the 1972 Shanghai Joint Communiqué summarized the tour and also summarized points of agreement or areas requiring further talks. Some of these included the following. The PRC supported communist reunification of Vietnam and Korea, whereas the U.S. pledged to draw down forces in Vietnam and leave soon, but not to do that in Korea. The PRC condemned Japanese militarism, while the U.S. pledged continuing friendship with Japan, and both supported peaceful democracy in Japan. The PRC and the U.S. both basically supported the Pakistani position on Jammu and Kashmir territorial disputes, with varying wording. I want to quote now directly from several other points. Number 8. There are essential differences between China and the United States in their social systems and foreign policies. However, the two sides agreed that countries, regardless of their social systems, should conduct their relations on the principles of respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states, non-aggression against other states, non-interference in the internal affairs of other states, and equality and mutual benefit and peaceful coexistence. International disputes should be settled on this basis without resorting to the use or threat of force. The United States and the People's Republic of China are prepared to apply these principles to their mutual relations. And that's the end of point 8. I'll also note that if you read through a lot of the future meetings between U.S. and Chinese officials, those word choices, which were obviously very carefully negotiated when preparing the communique in 1972, those word choices recur over and over and over again in all of the future meetings, right? So you'll see things like Chairman Mao saying, "Yes, we have two different social systems," and things like that. Number 9 said, quote, "With these principles of international relations in mind, the two sides stated that A, progress toward the normalization of relations between China and the United States is in the interests of all countries. B, both wish to reduce the danger of international military conflict. C, neither should seek hegemony in the Asia-Pacific region, and each is opposed to efforts by any other country or group of countries to establish such hegemony. D, neither is prepared to negotiate on behalf of any third party or to enter into agreements or understandings with the other directed at other states." End quote. Now, the very contentious Taiwan issue was mostly set aside, except to say that it was being set aside and to reaffirm the position of the PRC as well as the U.S.'s reluctance to leave. Quote, "The United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States government does not challenge that position. It reaffirms its interest in a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. With this prospect in mind, it affirms the ultimate objective of the withdrawal of all U.S. forces and military installations from Taiwan. In the meantime, it will progressively reduce its forces and military installations on Taiwan as the tension in the area diminishes." End quote. The communiqué also stated intentions to promote bilateral U.S. People's Republic of China trade and future normalization of diplomatic relations. That bilateral trade point was followed up on the American side with a trip by Democratic House Majority Leader Hale Boggs and, perhaps most importantly, future Republican president, at the time House Minority Leader Gerald Ford, in 1972. And then subsequently, in 1973, there was the formation of the National Council for U.S.-China Trade, later renamed the U.S.-China Business Council, or USCBC. The embargo had been lifted in 1971, but there was still very little trade and not much reason to trade because China didn't yet have the resources to buy things from the U.S., even if they wanted to, and if they didn't care about protecting domestic sectors. Also, China didn't have enough surpluses of much of anything exportable to sell to the U.S. There was still a great deal of political resistance within China in the early 1970s to getting into business with American corporations, which we will come back to in a few minutes when we get to the transition of the late 1970s. China, in the closing phases of the Cultural Revolution, was interested in buying American agricultural output to feed the population. American growers wanted to be able to sell there too, like the Australian and Canadian agricultural sectors had been doing for years. Other U.S. corporations, by contrast, mostly wanted to wait until permanent normalization of relations before getting into business there, whether as buyers or sellers. At this point, we need to finally talk about Panda Diplomacy from April 1972, exactly 50 years ago as I record this month. Let's hear an excerpt from the secret Nixon tapes on the matter.
Mr. Crosby Noyes, please, of the Washington Star.
Yes, sir. Mr. Crosby Noyes.
Hello, Mr. President. How are you?
Fine, thank you, sir.
I don't have anything of earth-shaking importance enough for your column, but I thought you'd be interested to know that most of your readers would be more interested in this, I'm afraid, than what I say on international affairs or you say in your column. I noticed the Star had an editorial about our pandas.
Yes.
And I think you would be interested to know that I just told Ziegler at the morning briefing so that it could make the afternoon edition of the Star that Mrs. Nixon and I decided that the pandas should go to the National Zoo.
Oh, that's very good news indeed.
I think you should know, too, that we've, as you can imagine, the requests from over the country, the San Diego has a splendid zoo, St. Louis,
yes,
New York, Chicago, and the rest. But basically, this is the place for them from the standpoint, first, it's a national zoo rather than a local one. Second, and this was the key thing, the reason we were waiting on it, the key thing is climate. The panda, of course, we want to be sure they don't come over and die, and we find that the Washington climate is somewhat more mild than their usual habitat, but nevertheless cold enough we think for what they are. So So in any event, you're going to get the pandas.
We're going to get both of them.
Yeah. Oh yes. Now, as a matter of fact, let me tell you an interesting thing about that. You must not. you can only use on your own if you want. And went on and on. But I was talking to Rob Haldeman, who talked to his Chinese hosts, and this question of mating is very interesting. This is a male and a female. The problem, however, with pandas is that they don't know how to mate. The only way they learn how is to watch other pandas mate, you see? And so they're keeping them there a little while. These are younger ones to sort of learn, how it's done.
Learn the ropes.
Now, if they don't learn it, they'll get over here, nothing will happen. So I just thought you should have your best reporter out there to see whether these pandas have learned. So now that I've given you the story of pandas, let you get back to your more serious questions.
How soon are they arriving, sir?
April 1st. When we think about April 1st, I just asked Ziegler, and everything is shrouded in mystery even when the pandas arrive. And of course, as you know, the head of the National Zoo took the musk oxen over, and we're trying to work it out, although I don't know whether he's bringing them back or whether somebody else is. But so there they are. But I can imagine that zoo will get the biggest play in history.
We will.
Everybody want to see those.
Big deal.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. President.
But I just want you to know we do pay attention to the editorials in the Star. Now and then.
I'm glad to learn.
Okay.
Thank you.
As alluded to in the clip, China received a pair of musk oxen, I assume from Alaska, which doesn't seem as exciting or symbolic as pandas, although I do like them too. But Ling Ling and Sing Sing, born in the wild in China, joined the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. in April 1972. They did not produce any offspring until 1983, a full decade later, and none survived to adulthood anyway. She died in 1992, 20 years later, and he died in 1999. New pandas were brought over in December 2000, which I got to see on a 4th grade vacation my dad took me on, beginning my lifelong passion for traveling to zoos around the U.S. and the world. However, by this point, other zoos, like Atlanta, Los Angeles, and San Diego, had also received pandas from the Chinese government too. And here's the official, although not especially politically accurate, Smithsonian National Zoo summary of the 1972 animal exchange. Quote, "At dinner in Beijing, China in February 1972, First Lady Patricia Nixon mentioned her fondness for giant pandas to the Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. As a gesture of goodwill following President Nixon's seminal state visit, Premier Zhou gifted 2 giant pandas to the American people. Nestled in the nation's capital and with free admission, the President and Mrs. Nixon selected the Smithsonian's National Zoo as the home for the first giant panda bears at a U.S. zoo. On April 16, 1972, the giant pandas Ling Ling, a female, and Sing Sing, a male, arrived at their new home. Over the next 20 years, Ling Ling and Sing Sing produced 5 cubs. Sadly, none of the offspring survived for more than a few days. But ever since their arrival, the pandas have symbolized cross-cultural collaboration between the United States and China." End quote. Now, what's not mentioned in that account from the Smithsonian is that panda diplomacy was not really the result of an offhand comment by First Lady Pat Nixon to Zhou Enlai during the trip, but rather, in fact, it was a planned animal exchange as part of a long-standing practice of the People's Republic of China government at the time to promote goodwill with literally dozens and dozens of countries from the late 1950s through the 1960s, when the PRC was seeking diplomatic and economic ties with those countries. Beginning in the 1980s, the government's policy would be changed from a permanent gift program to a long-term loan or lease program, and there was a growing emphasis on scientific research in cooperation with Chinese scientists. The arrangements are increasingly expensive, especially with the climatic and dietary needs of the pandas, and I do think it's interesting that most of these points of things that ended up cropping up as potential problems with the panda diplomacy in Nixon's secretly recorded phone call with that reporter basically did end up happening. Everything that he mentioned as a potential concern or consideration that created challenges was something that did end up being a challenge or a problem for the National Zoo's panda program when it started. This brings us now to the interregnum period, we might call it, from 1973 to 1978. After the flurry of regular diplomacy and panda diplomacy between the U.S. and China during Nixon's first term, ahead of the 1972 U.S. elections, activity mostly died down for almost 6 years, apart from a state visit by President Ford, which we will come back to in a moment. There are several key reasons in both countries for this, basically summarized in both cases as domestic political instability. Now, to be fair, Nixon's main objective of peace overtures to China in order to secure a U.S. withdrawal plan in Vietnam had succeeded by January 1973, when the Paris Peace Accords were signed. Vietnamization of the war effort continued as U.S. troops began preparing for an exit, and the alleged secret decent interval policy was adopted, whereby North Vietnam would effectively allow the U.S. to get out of South Vietnam completely and wait for a bit, and then militarily defeat South Vietnam's forces and unify the country by force in the absence of foreign opposition. So after the beginning of 1973, the U.S. under Nixon had more or less gotten what it wanted from China. The Nixon administration was also continuing to bolster détente with the Soviet Union, which was deeply unpopular with Chairman Mao in his efforts to continue playing the two off of each other. Senior Chinese officials repeatedly denounced détente negotiations directly to American officials at the highest level as Chamberlain-esque appeasements of a new Soviet Hitler. Mao himself referred to the Soviets by the euphemism the social imperialists. Understandably, this very hard line rhetorically temporarily created some challenges for building further U.S.-Chinese diplomacy. But the bigger picture after the Paris Accords was the internal collapses and reshuffling of leadership in both the U.S. and China around the same time. Mao, who had already been in poor health when Nixon visited in 1972, was continuing to fare poorly and would eventually die in 1976, not long after Zhou Enlai. Inside China, oddly mirroring the U.S. situation, there was a loosey-goosey struggle for power and party control toward the end of the Cultural Revolution. Nixon made his way out the door slowly and dramatically with the Watergate scandal unfolding over 1973 and into 1974. Gerald Ford had unprecedentedly become vice president by congressional confirmation after the resignation of corrupt Spiro Agnew, then unexpectedly elevated to the presidency without any national election much to the consternation of diplomatic partners in China, however familiar a process it might have been from their own internal standpoint. Ford served out the 2.5 years remaining on the term, and he did eventually make another trip to China in December 1975, this time as president, but of course, this was a really transitional period for him, even if he didn't know the full extent to which it would be. Kissinger's eyes-only memo preparing Ford for a meeting with the by now very unwell Chairman Mao provides a fascinating snapshot into the state of relations between the two countries at the time, at the end of 1975, and the role that political instability in both was playing on their diplomacy. However, Ford's 1975 visit did not result in any significant announcements or policy changes, which is why I refer to it as the interregnum, also in a nod to the leadership changes in both countries. Both Ford and Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping delivered speeches explicitly quoting from the 1972 Shanghai Communique and effectively just reaffirming all of its contents, although Deng then added some harsh remarks against U.S.-Soviet détente and expressed the view from Chairman Mao that war by the Soviets against the combined Americans and Chinese was inevitable and, quote, nothing can prevent the storm, end quote. In general, the now-released transcripts of the December 1975 meetings between Ford and Deng reveal quite a tense point in the new bilateral relationship, and mostly around the issue of the Soviet Union, not any direct U.S.-China problems or disputes. It makes for fascinating reading, but again, it shows that there wasn't a significant policy shift during this period, either backwards or forwards. It was just kind of a holding pattern. In fact, Ford told Chairman Mao as 1975 drew to a close that he believed 1977, i.e. after the U.S. presidential election, would be the most optimal time to resume work on advancing the U.S.-China bilateral relationship. However, the next year, although Ford beat back a strong challenge from the right by Ronald Reagan, he was in turn defeated by Jimmy Carter in November 1976. By that time, both Cho and Mao were dead anyway. So both countries during this period had had a nearly complete turnover in senior leadership, often very chaotically in both countries. However, the role of China in the American political and economic story of the 1970s was not over yet, and by the middle of Carter's term, around 1978, they both needed each other enough to get back to the table to make further progress. This brings us to the Carter phase, which takes us to the end of the 1970s. Before President Carter could normalize diplomatic relations with China, he needed to work out a lot of specific delicate details, most of which had been completely sidestepped in the 1971-72 negotiations. Reflecting a little over 40 years later in 2019 on his approach at the time, Carter explained his strategy for getting to a compromise. Quote, rather than selecting a career diplomat as my chief negotiator, I named Leonard Woodcock, who had proven his negotiating skill as the head of the United Auto Workers, a major American labor union. I sent him to Beijing with the rank of ambassador. Rather than immediately and directly confront the sensitive issue of Taiwan, Woodcock proposed that we obtain early successes on less controversial issues, which would set the tone for the two sides to settle the hard issues involving Taiwan at the end of the process. This principle of elevating areas of agreement over disagreement proved to be quite effective and constantly moved the negotiations forward. Of all that I was able to achieve during my term as president, normalization with China may have been the most beneficial to world peace and understanding, end quote. So once that negotiation work was completed, the United States and the People's Republic of China signed another communique on normalizing relations on December 15, 1978, to take effect January 1, 1979. President Carter addressed the nation live on television to announce the new communique and summarize some of its various terms, including clearer recognition of the One China policy regarding the people in Taiwan, an issue that had been mostly hand-waved away in the Nixon years as simply something to be resolved or addressed later by peaceful means. And the United States gave formal notice alongside the new communique that they would be withdrawing all U.S. military forces from Taiwan 1 year later by January 1980, which they did. All future U.S.-Taiwanese ties would be guided by new formulations Carter signed in the Specialized Taiwan Relations Act of April 1979, which would no longer accept the old Republic of China terminology. But first, let's hear some other excerpts from Carter's December 1978 address to the nation on the communique.
Good evening. I would like to read a joint communique which is being simultaneously issued in Peking at this very moment by the leaders of the People's Republic of China. A joint communique on the establishment of diplomatic relations between the United States of America and the People's Republic of China, January 1st, 1979. The United States of America and the People's Republic of China have agreed to recognize each other and to establish diplomatic relations as of January the 1st, 1979. The United States recognizes the government of the People's Republic of China as a sole legal government of China. Within this context, the people of the United States will maintain cultural, commercial, and other unofficial relations with the people of Taiwan. The United States of America and the People's Republic of China reaffirm the principles agreed on by the two sides in the Shanghai Communique of 1972 and emphasize once again that both sides wish to reduce the danger of international military conflict. Neither should seek hegemony, that is, the dominance of one nation over others, in the Asia-Pacific region or in any other region of the world, and each is opposed to efforts by any other country or group of countries to establish such hegemony. Neither is prepared to negotiate on behalf of any other third party or to enter into agreements or understandings with the other directed at other states. The government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. Both believe that normalization of Sino-American relations is not only in the interest of the Chinese and American peoples, but also contributes to the cause of peace in Asia and in the world. The United States of America and the People's Republic of China will exchange ambassadors and establish embassies on March the 1st, 1979, unquote. We do not undertake this important step for transient tactical or expedient reasons. In recognizing the People's Republic of China, that it is a single government of China, we are recognizing simple reality.
Again, there's that key phrase, recognizing simple reality. It's obviously most associated with things like the Carter Malaise speech and so forth, but that general theme pervades all of the speeches from people like Nixon to Ford to Carter and so forth. And of course, Reagan differentiates himself by basically refusing to accept reality and doing his whole thing.
Before the estrangement of recent decades, the American and the Chinese people had a long history of friendship. We've already begun to rebuild some of those previous ties. Now, our rapidly expanding relationship requires a kind of structure that only full diplomatic relations will make possible.
Now, in the December 15th address announcing the new communique, President Carter also announced that China's new de facto leader, Deng Xiaoping, officially still the deputy premier, who had met with Ford so extensively 3 years before, would be visiting the White House in January 1976. This visit occurred over the 29th to the 31st of January. Carter and Deng publicly signed the document announced back in December, which had already taken effect. The Chinese diplomatic team compelled the Carter administration to bring former President Nixon to the ceremony, to great resistance, less than 5 years after his downfall and resignation. Deng then proceeded to various other American cities, much as Nixon had done on his visit to China in 1972, and he toured Coca-Cola in Georgia, the Johnson Space Center in Texas, and Boeing in Washington State, with a stop-off to visit Henry Kissinger. Deng then returned home to launch an ambitious reform program in the People's Republic. Vice President Walter Mondale also made a reciprocal visit to China in March 1979. Carter's efforts with China would pay off almost immediately for the United States later in 1979 and into the 1980s as the U.S. sought to unite the world against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This was one of a number of ways in which the seeds planted in the 70s on U.S.-China relations came to fruition later. But that does, as I said, bring us to the end of the 1970s, and therefore the scope of this series. One flash forward, however, that we can't skip is the biggest delayed result for the U.S. of its 1970s policy shift on China, as well as our previously covered look at the post-1971 modified reserve currency status of the U.S. dollar and associated treasury instruments. And that flash forward that we can't skip is the rise of the made-in-China consumer economy in the United States. This followed a key 1980 decision in the next and final year of the Carter administration. Quote, the United States first granted China Most Favored Nation, or MFN status, in 1980, which made trading with China more attractive by lowering tariffs on goods imported to the United States. This status was subject to annual renewal, end quote. And that's from an article that I had cited in earlier parts of this as well at ChinaBusinessReview.com from 2013. By the 1980s, Americans were, to some degree, already familiar with Made in Taiwan or Made in Hong Kong, and we'll be going on a very deep dive about trans-Pacific container shipping during and immediately after the Vietnam War in a future episode or episodes, but we're not there yet. Some multinational U.S. corporations began mainland Chinese operations in the late 1980s as Deng Xiaoping's socialism with Chinese characteristics business reforms took full effect, including special economic zones at new container ports, and U.S. investments there continued to grow during the 1990s. However, the competitive pressure and production offshoring associated with the late 1980s and 1990s was still mostly about places like Japan, Taiwan, Korea, Southeast Asian countries, as we'll cover in our containerization episode, and of course, Canada and Mexico after NAFTA in 1993. The biggest boom for made-in-China production by American companies, or very frequently by Asian-based privately owned or state-owned producer companies with factories in mainland China acting as suppliers to American brands, did not actually happen until quite late, namely after the Clinton administration in 2000 signed Permanent Normal Trade Relations, PNTR, and after the accession of the People's Republic of China to the World Trade Organization in late 2001, during the George W. Bush administration, as well as that administration's reliance on issuing public debt financed by China as a form of dollar recycling. Let's hear a November 2001 clip from U.S. Trade Representative for George W. Bush, Robert Zoellick, talking about WTO accession for China.
By adding China to the WTO, we strengthen the organization by further integrating China's 1.2 billion people and $1 trillion economy into the world market network. This step represents great progress for China, the WTO, and the world trading system.
It's time now to bring this all to a full closed loop. In January 2006, Zoellick, who was also previously involved with the World Wildlife Fund, was photographed at the giant panda breeding research base in Chengdu, China, hugging a panda cub. Here is the Washington Post's breathless account of the moment at the time. Quote, Zoellick's pose with Jingjing, a female cub born at the Chengdu facility in August, was seen at least in part as a signal to China about where he wants to steer U.S.-Chinese relations. The official New China News Agency received his message 10-4. It immediately transmitted a happy photo of Zoellick and Jingjing around the country, illustrating the government's view that good U.S.-China relations are essential and, in fact, getting better and better. Zoellick's gesture, in another reading, could also be seen as a signal of where he stands in the Washington debate about China. Interpreted that way, becoming a public panda hugger was an eloquent endorsement of the view that engagement with Beijing is the best path for the United States, and that China's emergence as an Asian power does not have to mean conflict in the Pacific. Quote, you want to know how the panda felt, he asked? Very soft, end quote. Zoellick, in a meeting with reporters, joked that he had discussed the various readings of his panda poses with his staff before agreeing to take Jingjing on his lap. Some aides had questioned whether the image was the right one to convey, he acknowledged, but he decided to go ahead because his wife wanted a photo of him with a panda. Quote, at my age, I listen to my wife, end quote. Thanks for listening to this episode, and consider subscribing at patreon.com/arsenalfordemocracy for $3 a month to support the show and more special episodes like this. This series has a special theme song called Cold War Echo by Kai Engel from the 2017 album Sustains, and I curated and added on top of it the political speech clips myself. As usual, the notes are posted in a PDF accompanying the episode.